This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sarepti, aka Craig of the Acid Horizon podcast. Today, we descend into one of the most enigmatic, profound, and strangely illuminating texts in the history of psychiatry. Memoirs of My Nervous Illness by Daniel Paul Schreber. In the early 1900s, Schreber, a former high-ranking judge, emerged from psychiatric confinement with a meticulously detailed account of his experiences, either a lucid confession of madness or a profound metaphysical system. At its core is a cosmic struggle, his unmanning, a forced transformation into a woman imposed by divine rays, which he saw as both persecution and the key to restoring the quote-unquote order of the world. Freud interpreted Schreber's visions as repressed homosexuality. Lacan saw them as a foreclosure of the symbolic order, and Deleuze Guattari viewed them as an explosion of desire, breaking free from Freud's Oedipal framework and revealing the social field's paranoid and fascistic investments. So, how do we read Schreber today? As a symptom? A prophet? A cosmologist? To help us unravel these questions, I'm joined once again by Devin Gouré, the returning guest from the Moral Minority podcast, where we will dissect the intersections of philosophy, theology, psychoanalysis, and so forth. Together, we'll explore Schreber's unmanning, his visions of divine persecution, and what his memoirs reveal about modernity, power, and perhaps even gender. Was Schreber's case a refutation of psychoanalysis, or its vindication? Is paranoia an individual affliction, or is it built into the structures of power and belief? And also, how do those of us who have experiences which approximate those of Judge Schreber's manage to integrate them into our lives in a way that's meaningful, or at least sustainable? Devin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Really excited to be back. Thank you for having me back and to talk about this topic in particular, a little different than the usual Nietzsche stuff that I think people have heard me go through on here before, as well as other podcasts. So I'm excited to discuss the Schreber case with you.
Maybe we should tell folks why this is even on the map for us right now, because we have a reading group that we share. Maybe you could say a few things about it.
Yeah, we've been doing this multi-podcast reading group on Deleuze Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. That's with Acid Horizon, Moral Minority, and Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And this has been going since last December, and we're working our way kind of gradually through Anti-Oedipus. But it's not, it just kind of, we intended not just as a reading group, but also as sort of broader kind of community for experimenting with applying schizoanalytic concepts from Anti-Oedipus to the present state of things in politics and in society. And I think what particularly interested a lot of people in going back to Anti-Oedipus has been the clear resurgence of far-right authoritarianism, whether you want to call it fascism or not. I think in Deleuze Guattari's sense, in the way they use the term fascism and Anti-Oedipus, it's in this broader psychological sense, in which case we could clearly identify the MAGA movement, as well as many other resurgent authoritarian movements around the world that have now consolidated power in states like Hungary or Turkey or India.
And even here too. Coming soon to a theater near you.
Accelerating rapidly as we speak in the United States under Trump's second administration. If we even want to call it an administration anymore, it's the term itself seems quaint relative to, it's, and at any rate, but there's a famous passage from the Anti-Oedipus that many people, I think many of your listeners will be familiar with, where they pose the question with Wilhelm Reich: how is it that the masses came to actually desire fascism, not be duped or have the wool pulled over their eyes or deceived by the people in power in some way, but actually to invest desire in this sadistic regime that deliberately and mechanically, industrially inflicted mass death and suffering on populations identified as deviant, right? And, if we take that as this fundamental core of the fascist psychological structure, Deleuze and Guattari are giving us a new kind of psychoanalytic Marxism that are not new now, but new at the time, emerging out of the May 1968 movement, a way of understanding the fascist psychology that is hopefully from a kind of Marxist materialist perspective, but also availing itself of the tools of Freudian psychoanalysis through a kind of eminent critique of Freud. And I think many of us were interested in going back to this text to see what it told us about the kind of psychological currents, the mass psychological currents that are driving support for these movements today. And, we all sort of and certainly in the United States, when it comes to electoral politics, you see the Democratic Party scrambling to understand psychologically how to motivate large groups of the population that seem to be drifting towards this far right reaction. Whether it's minority groups, the Democrats thought they could reliably count on as voters shifting towards the Republican Party, young men shifting heavily towards the Republican Party. I think people circle around this fundamental kind of social psychological question of why is it that the fascist movement can appear as an obvious form of irrationality, right? You're doing horribly irrational things like accelerating fossil fuel production at a time where we desperately need to be decarbonizing the entire economy, right? Things that are manifestly irrational, but nonetheless have this mass psychological appeal that demands some kind of explanation. And so I think one reason for looking at the Schreber case as well is that there, in addition to being this rich, one of the richest texts ever written by a madman himself, actually articulating in an attempted scientific way his own fantasy, but it also gives us this social landscape of kind of proto-fascist desire. And I say this not in a way, not attempting to moralize or condemn Schreber in some way, but rather we can see in the context of the late 19th and early 20th century Germany, these kind of emerging social conflicts that will later crystallize in the German form of fascism under the Nazi movement. We see them kind of battling it out in Schreber's mind, in the delusions that he writes about in his book. And there are interesting ways to pick apart this fantasy that Schreber gives us to show both the ways in which they elicit a kind of reactionary fascist investment of desire, but also rebel against that, transgress against it, and find some way of resolving, perhaps we hope more productively, the kind of paranoid tension that might sometimes tend towards real fascism.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that we want to unpack here today is how can something like a psychotic episode function as a kind of crystal into which we can see the broader contours of our current and emergent socio-political landscape, if that's even possible. So that's contentious. That's on the table and something that we want to talk about. But maybe a first place to start is the life of Judge Schreber himself. This is somebody who has endowed to us this incredibly lucid account of successive psychological ruptures that he experienced in his life and maintained a kind of credence towards them where as you know in the blog piece that I will link in the show notes, that he believes at some level that there was this kind of divine communication happening and this sort of cosmological or metaphysical insight. But let's find out why and when or how he had perhaps his first break, and what is the sort of timeline in Schreber's life that we're looking at here.
Yeah, let's talk through the kind of the basics of his biography and what kind of the context is for how he finds himself in this situation. So Schreber's dilemmas when it comes to the obvious signs of madness begin in 1884. Prior to this, Schreber was born in Leipzig. He is a judge in the Saxon court, in the courts of Saxony, and he has also made attempts at getting more heavily involved in politics, and particularly ran for the Reichstag just before, and lost an election to the Reichstag just before he has this first break or this first illness in 1884. And in this first illness, he tells us this passes without any occurrences bordering on the supernatural. But he's struck by an attack of severe hypochondria. And this is unlike anything that he's experienced before, but seems to be a relatively straightforward case of, one might say, his father's obsession with health that he was brought up with, perhaps coming out in a kind of paranoid form. And during this bout of hypochondria, he goes to the clinic at the University of Leipzig under the care of Dr. Paul Emil Flechsig. And Schreber reports to us that Flechsig's treatment was effective. He was rapidly cured. And by the end of 1885, he was able to resume his work as a judge. And he then passed 8 years relatively undisturbed. He tells us his happiness marred only by the repeated disappointment of hope in having children, which is something that, I note a few of these things that he mentions because of the ways that we can see failed wish fulfillment, factoring in perhaps, the one way of reading this is the failure to bear children with his wife was something that could be a motivating factor in Schreber's fantasy. But what follows after is the more serious illness, and this begins in 1893. So we have 8 years after his bout of hypochondria, and in the first case, nothing supernatural in his mind occurs. But in October of 1893, Schreber is appointed the presiding judge of the Superior Court in Dresden. And he feels that he isn't fully up to the role. He very quickly starts to struggle under the weight of his new duties and have concerns about his own qualifications. And throughout this period where he's starting to be overwhelmed by work, he reports to us in the memoirs that he had several dreams that at that time he didn't attribute any particular significance, but one of which stands out to him. And I'll go ahead and read it because it forms the centerpiece of most psychoanalytic readings of Schreber's book. Schreber says, "One morning while still in bed, whether still half asleep or already awake, I cannot remember, I had a feeling which, thinking about it later when fully awake, struck me as highly peculiar. It was the idea that it really must be rather pleasant to be a woman succumbing to intercourse. This idea was so foreign to my whole nature that I may say I would have rejected it with indignation if fully awake. From what I have experienced since, I cannot exclude the possibility that some external influences were at work to implant this idea in me." So after having these dreams and after being overwhelmed by work, Schreber's breakdown really begins, and the experiences that the experiences that he takes to be supernatural and that he'll report in his book, and in particular the fantasy of persecution, the paranoid persecution fantasy that he'll develop that centers around this threat of being unmanned, of being transformed into a woman, start to develop in the wake of these dreams and this collapse at work. And the breaking point is that Schreber has immense difficulty sleeping. He goes nights without sleep because he hears noises, crackling noises in the walls that are disrupting his sleep. And after a abortive suicide attempt, he checks himself back into Flechsig's asylum at the University of Leipzig. And this is when things really start to go downhill for Schreber. So not only is Schreber unable to cure his insomnia, not only is Flechsig unable to, by medical means, or by pharmaceutical means, get Schreber to sleep consistently or reliably, Schreber begins to develop a persecution fantasy that is directed towards Flechsig, beginning with certain perceptions of Flechsig deliberately persecuting him in specific ways in the actual clinic. Schreber develops, or a delusional system crystallizes, in which he believes that Flechsig has entered into some kind of contact with his soul. And as a result of this soul contact, is trying to commit something that Schreber calls soul murder. And what this means for Schreber is that he is what Flechsig is threatening to do is to somehow separate or evacuate his soul from his body, leaving his body both castrated, transformed into a woman, and available for sexual abuse in this world. So this is the kind of early kernel of Schreber's delusion that starts to accelerate in 1894 and 1895. When he starts out in Flechsig's asylum at the University of Leipzig, he's then transferred briefly to a different asylum under Dr. Pearson before finally being transferred to Sonnenstein Castle, which had another asylum that he would eventually stay in up until his release in 1902. But these persecution delusions about Flechsig quickly become connected to an elaborate religious system. And I think I don't want to go ahead and dive into the entire thing, Craig, so let me just sketch out a couple points about Schreber's kind of religious system. But the primary idea is that what initially seems to be a persecution fantasy centered around Flechsig is transferred seemingly to an idea that it is God himself that is making, Schreber calls it, nerve contact with his soul. And this nerve contact results in Schreber experiencing something that is, I think, a familiar feature for many people who have experienced psychotic episodes, whether of a schizophrenic or a bipolar variety, which is what sort of starts as thought echo, or having kind of automatic thoughts that you don't feel individually responsible for, and that then transferring itself into verbal hallucination. So Schreber starts to experience voices that he takes to be souls that have lodged themselves in his person, along with God himself being lodged there. And that the reason this has happened is that he has some kind of immense attractive power for God through this substance that he calls nerves. In Schreber's cosmology, nerves are this kind of fundamental kind of ontological substance almost. It's the fundamental stuff of the world. And through nerve contact, God has sort of become trapped within Schreber. And as a result of the fact that Schreber's nerves exert this kind of overwhelming, Schreber thinks unprecedented in human history, overwhelming power of attraction upon God. And so Schreber will tell us that he thinks this kind of nerve attraction is what accounts for phenomena throughout history, like prophets or people having dream visions or experiencing demonic possession. So we'll see. And this is in one of the more interesting features of Schreber's book is the way in which he is always trying to resituate what he's experiencing in this kind of quasi-scientific vocabulary, which much of the time amounts to him taking the experiences fully literally and then trying to just describe them as scientifically as possible, let's say. But Schreber thinks this kind of nerve attraction that the prophets experienced is something that he has to an even greater degree. And this has put him in a distinctive position in all of human history where God's fate is completely entwined with his own as a result of God being trapped within his nerves in some fashion. God being trapped within him not only is what threatens Schreber constantly with castration. Schreber experiences himself as being forced to become a woman in order to give God sexual pleasure. But Schreber also tells us it exposes God himself to danger. And there are also numerous features of Schreber's fantasy then that will be centered around trying to rectify this rift in what he calls the order of the world that is caused by both God's violation of his person and the vulnerability that God now experiences thereby. I think that's a pretty good beginning summary, Craig, of the kind of general features. As anybody I think familiar with the book will see, that there's so many different symbolic features of the fantasy that each serve different kind of, and I think to take Deleuze and Guattari's language, seemingly machinic functions within this kind of economy of Schreber's soul, which is crisscrossed by these cosmic energies that are constantly kind of coming into him and passing through him and exiting him. And this is what he's trying to describe. And I think what's interesting is the way in which one of the interesting features of this is how people pick on for sort of different specific aspects of this. Freud in particular in his reading is interested in these twittering birds that Schreber has in his head that he analogizes to little girls. But there's also this vast social and religious component where Schreber has anxieties about the Catholicization of Germany. He has fantasies about becoming Jewish, being transformed into a Jew, and associating this Jewish role with a kind of messianic redemptive position. And this is where you can start to see anti-Semitic anxieties in Germany, kind of the traces of the campaign to really push Protestantism aggressively as a state religion under Bismarck and the Kulturkampf. You can see all these kind of contours of German society and culture at the time starting to make its way into Schreber's fantasy as well.
And the common move at this point would be to pivot to Freud, to Lacan, and maybe even Deleuze and Guattari to examine this case further. But I think to honor Schreber, I'd like to just dig into his cosmology just a little bit more. One of the fascinating things about the world that he sees amidst his psychotic episode is that we're presented with a God who's not necessarily omniscient. And also, not only is there a sort of epistemological rift, there's a kind of ethical rift as well, where God only really deals with corpses. He doesn't completely understand the plight of living human beings. And it's Schreber who's then tasked, as you mentioned, with sort of mending this divide. Maybe it's just, like I said, to honor Schreber's memory. What do you think's happening there with a cosmological vision where there is a God who might not be omniscient or omnipresent or having all of the features that we ordinarily associate with the Western conception of God?
Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating aspects of it, and I think it's not just a matter of doing justice to Schreber. I think it's also seeing the way in which, I mean, I guess the way I would think about it is doing justice to Schreber means understanding that whatever our ultimate interpretation of what his delusion or fantasy means. Say, if we take Freud's view, it's repressed homosexuality directed at Flechsig that is the cause of his, ultimately the cause of the hallucinations. But regardless of what we think it means, Schreber experiences this fantasy as exacting certain kind of constraints on his person. And those constraints he treats as real. And they have real impacts on how he takes himself being as obligated to behave. And we can see ways in which, as Schreber's fantasy develops, he adopts certain strategies that even fully believing that, fully believing in the reality of this fantasy, right? And I want to be clear, to just like noting in terms of how we talk about these things, I am not making any judgment either way in terms of talking the way I approach talking about psychotic experiences. And I think we'll get into this a little bit later in this episode as well, in terms of how I think about it personally. But if we're approaching this, I think you want to suspend any kind of reality judgment and just say, well, we know that for Schreber this is real, right? And real, at least in the sense that it has a brute phenomenological reality that he can't avoid, right? He can't help but be subjected to these experiences. And he is doing his best to make sense of what is happening to him in some way. And one of the interesting things, I think, goes unappreciated ultimately in Freud, and we can get into some of the reasons why, is the way that Schreber, remarkably, by 1902, seems to have reached a point where he's described by his doctor as what we would think of as functional in a day-to-day environment, acting quote unquote normally by the judgment of his doctors in social settings around everyday people, with the one peculiar enduring feature that he still believes that all of this fantasy really was in fact real, had religious significance, needs to be reported in his book for scientific and religious purposes. And what we see is that he has actually navigated his way through the fantasy in such a way that he has attained a kind of synthesis, a kind of equilibrium by the end of the book. And to get into some of these details, Craig, as you said, this is very closely related to God's peculiar status in Schreber's fantasy. As you know, God is not omnipotent and not omniscient in Schreber's fantasy, and there are a couple of reasons why. The first, as you indicated, and what Schreber describes as a kind of red thread that runs through his entire experience, is this idea that God is almost exclusively concerned with corpses and has almost no experience dealing with living human beings. And in Schreber's cosmology, what this means is that God essentially interacts with souls once they have exited kind of this material existence and entered what he calls the four courts of heaven. And at that point, souls, or the bodies themselves, are dead, right? And that's what God's main interaction with human souls is in that context. He occasionally will, as we mentioned in the case of a prophet, in the case of visionary figures, will make brief nerve contact with the soul of a living human being. But for Schreber, it's important that God, in primarily dealing with the dead, has certain fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of a relationship with a living human being. And because of those misunderstandings, there is something Schreber tells us, there's something in God's interactions with him that are contrary to the order of the world. And this is the kind of second main way, I'd say, in which God isn't omnipotent in Schreber's fantasy, which is that God is fundamentally bound by the order of the world. And there is this sort of remarkable passage. I'm going to find the passage just because I think it's an interesting one to read. Schreber will tell us here in this passage that he, as a kind of weak human being, is able to triumph over God in his struggle because the order of the world is on his side. I'll read the quote quickly. "I'm inclined to regard the whole thing as a matter of fate, in which neither on God's nor on my part can there be a question of moral infringement. On the contrary, the order of the world reveals its very grandeur and magnificence by denying even God himself, in so irregular a case as mine, the means of achieving a purpose contrary to the order of the world. All attempts at committing soul murder, at unmanning me for the purposes contrary to the order of the world, that is to say, for the sexual satisfaction of a human being, and later at the destruction of my reason, have failed. From this apparently so unequal battle between one weak human being and God himself, I emerge, albeit not without bitter sufferings and deprivations, victorious, because the order of the world is on my side." So we get this idea then that because of this misunderstanding that God has, God subjects Schreber to these essentially what are essentially unreasonable or unfair demands. And as Schreber notes in that passage, it's not a matter of moral infringement, but the issue is that souls in the four courts of heaven, having been detached from their bodily circumstances, are able to participate in what he sees as this kind of unending joy, bliss, voluptuousness. God therefore expects this unending bliss from a living human being, even though it is not possible within our kind of finite embodied conditions. It is through this expectation that God subjects Schreber to his unmanning. God demands that Schreber become a woman and experience, to take the way psychoanalytic the Lacanians will refer to it, experience feminine jouissance, produce feminine jouissance for the sake of God. But there's this fundamental violation of the order of the world that is entailed therein. And this violation is what, in Schreber's system, in the system he develops, makes Schreber, the living individual, vulnerable to the plots and conspiracies of Flechsig or other persecutors. So precisely because God has, in violating the order of the world, become so fixated upon Schreber's nerves, Schreber's become an attractor for souls of all kinds. And he often calls these tested souls or impure souls, among which Flechsig's is the most prominent. But he experiences these as kind of persecuting souls that have entered him as a result of the kind of violation that God has effected, even if God has done so unknowingly. And this is, again, these sort of broad outline, but what Schreber, the position that Schreber ends up in, is finding a way to kind of navigate this and resolve this unfair demand. So by the end of the memoirs, where we find Schreber, and in this, when he's completing this, it's towards the end. It's getting close to when he'll actually be released from the asylum. He's become reconciled to the idea that God will never actually, the attractive power of his nerves is so great that God will never actually release his hold on him. So Schreber has to effect a kind of compromise where he has sort of accepted his obligation to give God feminine pleasure of a certain kind, but he has managed to establish a kind of balance where he can do so at certain times. He can sort of allow this kind of deterritorialization or becoming woman at times, while then also allowing his mental nerves, enough rest to maintain what he considers at the time his functionality, his sanity, right? And what's one of the things that's so interesting about his release is that he petitions the court for his release, and petitions for several years, and represents himself. He's not under the representation of any attorney. And of course, we know Schreber's a legal expert and is able to marshal his considerable legal expertise in his own defense. But it is striking that at precisely this point where he sort of described himself as achieving a sort of equilibrium, we see his text operating as this paradoxical piece of evidence in the court, where for Weber, his doctor, the fact that Schreber would publish this and come out with this entire system is evidence that he must still be insane and must therefore remain under this incompetency order and remain confined to the asylum. By contrast, the court ultimately finds, well, it seems that he believes this, right? But nonetheless, an individual able to write this has to be of sufficient sound mind, and go through this entire process. So there's this fundamental paradox. So is the book evidence of madness, or is it evidence of sanity? And for different parties involved, it's both. And to some extent, that paradox, I think, reflects the paradoxical position that Schreber has reached at the time. And it is one where he has effected his own, albeit temporary, cure for his condition that does not eliminate the psychosis, right? He still experiences the invading voices, but he's found some way of mitigating them, of accommodating himself to them, some way of assuming what he takes to be his fate without it fully destroying his person and robbing him of his reason.
And that brings me to the question then of pathology, because I have different ways of understanding this term. I think there's a conventional sense in which when we think of pathology, we think of an immediate pivot to diagnostics or finding a diagnosis for something. There's also an aspect to pathology when I think about the work of James Hillman. For example, I think about the Greek term pathos, especially in terms of the deep emotional well of psyche, for example, that not only produces pleasure, but it produces pain. And there's a way in which the contents of the unconscious or the imaginary, whatever we want to call it, produce for us images that, in the case of Schreber, are to be tarried with in some sense, or at least engaged with in a way where they demand to be processed and at least rendered intelligible, or at the very least, these are images with which Schreber needs to find a way to live in equilibrium in the end. That then brings me to a concept like intensity that we see in Deleuze and Guattari, where we can think of subjectivity as this confluence of pleasures and pains that are consumed by something we call the subject, and maybe even something in excess of what we understand to be ordinarily as subjectivity. Like, what is the subjectivity of the psychotic break, for example? Clearly, it's not what we understand as our normal everyday subjectivity, because in the case of Schreber, his whole schedule of reinforcement and pleasure and pain is radicalized by the visions that he's having. So I was hoping you could say a few things about just the term pathology, and what do you think is the best way to understand that term in the context of not only Schreber's case, but interpreting these psychotic breaks?
Yeah. So I think that there are three different uses of it that I would distinguish in terms of, and this doesn't correspond to any kind of like technical schema, but just kind of in the way I sort of categorize this when I try to think through the question of psychosis and whether we should categorize it within the head under the heading of mental illness and what it means to do so. So the first meaning of pathology is what I would take to be what we can characterize as the pathology paradigm of modern psychiatry. In this sense, I think pathology is used in a heavily medical way, right? A pathology is very similar to a bacterial infection or a viral infection, right? These are pathologies, these are pathogens. And the idea is that we can model psychiatric illness in some kind of similar way along the lines of physiological causes. So I'd say the first meaning, which I reject pretty much, unconditionally, is pathology is involving a physiological view of psychotic experience as something that we need to analogize to a physical illness with a comparable etiology, right? Which is not, to be clear, which is not to deny physical differences, right? I'm not a Cartesian dualist. We're not saying that different things aren't going on physically in someone's brain when they're having but to analogize these to physical diseases. That's the form of pathology that I think is common in psychiatry that I think is we ought to reject. However, there's a sort of second, I would say, normative notion of pathology that it's a little harder to get around. So this normative notion is something that is closer to what classic psychoanalysis is getting at, which as you're indicating, Craig, is getting us to ask questions about and try to form insights into what is causing us to causing our lives to fall into certain sorts of contradictions. And so when I think of pathology in this sense, I think and say its contrast, health. I mean, this is something I've talked about when I'm working through, on my work on Nietzsche as well, is that I do think we can retain the term pathology for a kind of psychoanalytic approach that asks what kind of imminent contradictions a subject continues to fall into, which from his or her own perspective produce suffering or distress, right? And finding how we can lead them out of those kinds of continual contradictions through a kind of imminent critique. So pathology here in this sense is closer to, I think, to kind of come back to what we've been talking about with the Schizoanalysis Project and Deleuze and Guattari. They talk about immanent and transcendent uses of the syntheses of desire, or sometimes they say legitimate versus illegitimate. And the idea here is not a moralizing claim, but to point out that certain ways of directing and synthesizing desire fall prey to certain kinds of contradictions or get trapped in double binds that produce paranoid forms, that produce fascisizing forms of desire. So I think there are still ways of making sense of the term pathology in this kind of normative sense. And the question is and I mean normative very broadly, just like, are there better or worse ways of doing something? And can we elicit criteria of some sort for those better or worse ways, right? I don't mean necessarily a like Kantian rules-based picture, but some broadly normative notions of like health versus pathology. I think it's hard for psychoanalysis to escape from those ultimately, and that it's a matter of kind of discussing which perspective, whether it's a Nietzschean one or a Freudian one or a schizoanalytic one, best gives us the tools to unpack those normative notions without presupposing these toxic ideas of normalcy, right, and normalization. And then I guess I would say the third version, which gets us to sort of the Schreber question, and is more of a personal one, which is so in my own psychotic experiences, it's important for me to understand that I will I will have a whole spectrum of experiences, right? As bipolar. So say I'm just going to say my diagnosis is bipolar disorder, but bracketing the question of diagnosis because I don't particularly care about psychiatric diagnoses. Let's just say that my experience is characterized by these significant mood swings that on the manic sometimes have result in full psychotic episodes, right? But that means that there's times where I'm hypomanic, there's times where I'm really manic, but I haven't passed over the threshold quite into full psychosis. And then I think that I like from my own personal standpoint, I've found that I do have to appeal to some idea of being functional. And it's crucial when I say that I don't mean functional in the sense of that, modern society considers to be functional and productive, but functional in the sense of I can endure and live with this experience and turn it towards what I consider to be creative, productive purposes, say art and writing, rather than be in a condition where I have to go to the hospital, or I'm doing things like opening the car door to try to jump out when my wife is driving me to the hospital, right? That's something that I've done before in a psychotic episode, right? And that's something for me is like I need to understand as somebody who is like has to, live with psychosis, like it's meaningful to say that's pathological, right? I at this point in time would not want to do that, right? What isn't helpful for me in avoiding that pathology is that is the first form of the pathology paradigm. What's not helpful for me is saying this is just an illness, I have to suppress it, right? And in the same way I'd suppress a physical illness, I don't have to deal with it in these other ways. To me, that's more likely to get me to pathology point, the third version that I really, really want to avoid. Whereas instead, interrogating, doing something, I'm not trying to put up Schreber as a model, but doing something like what he does in terms of interrogating his illness is turning it into a system and finding a way to live within that system, for me, has been closer to what helps keep me functional in the sense of, not having to go to the hospital, being able to leverage these kind of manic experiences I have for creative purposes. So not to go on for too long but I think it's worth talking about because this is we're at an important moment, I think, in terms of the development of mad studies and just like we live in mad times. I mean, we're at a moment where we need to renegotiate the language we use to describe these experiences and states, and I think it's open to contestation. And so it's why it's important, I think, to really interrogate pathology as one of these terms that we do unavoidably kind of gets grouped with these phenomena, but has these profound problems as well.
Yeah, and I guess my next question is not meant to by any means romanticize your condition, but when I did meet you in person for the first time a few months ago, we did talk about the kinds of residues that these experiences produce for you, and you've done some writing, for example. Is there a way in which for you, maybe in the same vein as Schreber, that these residues persist with you in your ordinary everyday experience of the world? Or is there a way in which you've tried to make them intelligible to yourself in a way that's productive in the artistic sense or the philosophical sense of things? And, to what extent do you feel that you have been successful or maybe failed at that task?
Yeah, it's a great question. And thanks for, giving me the opportunity to speak about topics that are, personal on this
Oh
level. I
yeah,
think
and I should say, yeah,
you
thank you for opening up about this because this is a vulnerable spot.
well, I think it's important for people who have these experiences to be open when they can, when they feel that they can, not putting pressure on anybody when they feel that they can, because I do think it is true that, and I think this bears the data in studies, psychological studies bears this out, that we have seen real shifts societally in terms of stigmatization of mental illness like depression and anxiety, because you can't live in today's world without having depression and anxiety of some kind. Psychotic disorders, though, remain more heavily stigmatized than others, and certainly at a time when we have a Secretary of Health and Human Services who apparently wants to put people like me in camps to re-educate us or whatever. I think it's important to contest that stigma. I think I to kind of give some context relative to what I was saying about pathology. I have chosen not to take the direction of simply suppressing my condition with antipsychotics. It's not that I don't take any medication. I take a combination of mood stabilizers, but I'm not on lithium or risperidone or some of the common antipsychotics that I think really people do experience as just dulling them out completely. And I do feel strongly that that's a place where people that's not a way to live. And I think that that's not coming from the standpoint of somebody who hasn't been in that place before, who hasn't tried taking those drugs. I think that's how people really feel when they're in that place. And it's not to say that they want to then romanticize psychotic experiences, but the issue is that I think the issue is twofold. One, regardless of whether you've been diagnosed schizophrenic or bipolar, I think most people who have undergone these experiences have some form of spiritual or religious or existential attachment to them, right? So a psychotic experience is in some ways defined by its meaningfulness, by the fact that it strikes you as just overwhelmingly meaningful. And for me personally, I was in grad school at the time. I was working on my dissertation. I had been staying up really, really late, getting very little sleep. And the psychotic episode I entered was very closely attached to the work I was doing on my dissertation, in the sense that I had made some kind of dramatic philosophical discovery that only now I was able to understand, and that this would be a world-changing kind of event, right? And the question is, you have this experience very intensely, right? And let's just take my own case. I produce hundreds of pages of writing in the midst of this, not just the first time, but have done so in later times where I have episodes. And these are writings that are still legible to me as philosophy of some kind, right? When I'm in my quote unquote lucid states, right? Or say when I'm depressed, when I'm on the other end of the spectrum. And if you don't want to take the approach of just anesthetizing the condition, then I don't think there's any way to avoid the hermeneutic dimension, where you are going to have to grapple. And for me, I have had to grapple with the sanity or insanity of these writings that I've produced, or these experiences that I've had. And this is, for me, a constant process of negotiation. I've written about it in some of what I've written on Nietzsche. I talk about psychotic seriousness. And I guess what I mean by this concept is that, or first of all, a recognition that while it may seem that the psychotic episode is just the aberration, in the sense that you're in an exceptional state that therefore causes you to have certain ideas that you would not otherwise have, it is also true that depression is a state that causes you to have certain ideas that you otherwise would not have. And that in general, the state is, if you have these kind of manic depressive kind of swings like I do, in general, that you in attending to yourself will recognize the ways in which your mood overwhelmingly shapes the actual content of the thoughts that you are having, in a way that can be extremely difficult to extricate yourself in any way from that. If it is not by playing those thoughts off one another in some fashion, right? And you can see the kind of how Nietzsche attempts this in his style, but to really make a record of and kind of compare and log, the ways in which my thought tends when I'm depressed, the ways in which my thought tends when I'm manic, and then further the kind of thought structures that I produce when I'm fully in a psychotic state. And for me, that does mean that I have to, on the one hand, retain a certain faithfulness to like the meaning of these experiences I've had. At the same time, I have to be very vigilant to make sure that that does not cause me the kind of dysfunction that I described earlier in my everyday life. And I think that the level of success that I've achieved is simply that, I'm not trying to paint myself as a successful case. I still have a great deal of difficulty functioning in terms of day-to-day kind of administrative shit. And I'm just like a generally disorganized person. I don't think I will ever be the kind of like on top of it organized person that's something, but like, the last time I was in the hospital was 2021, and I managed to hold down a job and produce my philosophy content. And that is without fully suppressing the kind of psychotic manic tendencies, but it's also similar to Schreber without fully suppressing some belief in the reality of what I experienced, right? And what that means is that I have, I think people who have bipolar often have the kind of messianic savior delusions, and I certainly have that kind of, there's that element of my experiences. But I think also more broadly, I have a lot of difficulty that I work through with apocalyptic fantasies that I have in these states. The sense that there's an imminent world crisis that has cosmic proportions that certain people are kind of like appointed to try to prevent in this kind of cosmic struggle. I have similar kind of ideas that I've had during these episodes that are not dissimilar to Schreber's in that respect. But then when I'm not fully in the episode, I have to face up to the fact that, well, a reasonable person can look at the world today and see it as a state of extreme crisis and collapse. A reasonable person can look at the world today and say that if we are going to dig ourselves out of the hole we've put ourselves in with climate change and resurgent fascism, then we might need to start entertaining some mad solutions to something, right? The what is considered along the horizon of what is reasonable so far has not worked, right? And so what the day-to-day struggle for me is that I don't, when I have those kind of fantasies, I don't then in my other states say, no, I'm not destined to save the world. I try to use the memory of that experience as an inspiration for something concretely I feel that I can do to realize what I take to be the valuable content of those experiences in practice, right? So theory and philosophy is for me what I've like it, the ways I've tried to channel that. And well, you know, I struggle to consistently put out writing content. There's a whole lot in terms I have kind of stored up that I'm still working on putting out that is ways that are attempts to articulate some of the visions that I have experienced in ways that I hope are. I hate to use a Rawlsian concept, but the concept of like public reason, like reasons or like ideas that could be accessible or could be affirmed by people that do not require them to share my like experience of a psychotic fantasy, right? Ways that I can articulate these like experiences that are more publicly comprehensible. So I still and I still try to do that. And I do think that if there's like a positive aspect of it, it's that I am able to retain a little bit more mad optimism in dark times than others might be able to. But I also experience significant distress because when I'm a great deal of the time, because we sit here and we watch horrible things happening in the world. And if you're still attached to the kind of messianic fantasy, you're like, shit, I'm supposed to stop this, right? It's on me. That's something I'm supposed to be doing right now. And it can feel, there can be this feeling of an immense burden, I think, for people who have been in that place when even if you're in a state where you're recognizing like me sitting here on my computer can do very little and I'm just going to have to do the best with what I can do politically, in terms of my, writing and artistic production, whatever else, whatever you want to say your task is, it can still be very difficult to negotiate those kind of conflicting perspectives. And I think that is what's often like very difficult for me is, feeling like I want to aspire, like I want to be able to have those like grandiose hopes that I have in manic episodes still inspire me when I'm not manic. I want to say if I'm doing philosophy, I don't want to say, in advance, like I can't be one of the most important philosophers of all time, right? Like it's absurd and mad to think that I would be. But to the extent that you rule it out in advance, of course, you'll never end up being that person either, right? I think there's something in which you can see a similar kind of play with those perspectives in Nietzsche's text. Ecce Homo is the kind of clearest case where it's like you have these grand aspirations and you recognize they're grandiose, you recognize how unreasonable they are, but you can still kind of affirm them in a way that might inspire hope rather than dysfunction. That's what I try, at least.
What do you think is either the meaning or function of that messianic image or impulse that arises? I think I read in your paper here, and to be honest, I hadn't looked at Lacan's interpretation of the Schreber case, but if I recall, he chalks it up to this dual lapse of the ego and inflation, which we could characterize the messianic experience as being kind of that. I mean, for yourself, from your first person perspective, what do you think's happening there?
Yeah. So I think one reason that Lacan has been quite useful for me in thinking about my own experiences is the way he centers this concept of the signifying chain of the unconscious and how that in Lacan, that concept is very heavily developed out of he very heavily develops in the context of trying to make sense of verbal hallucinations. And on this model of kind of mental automatism from de Clerambault, who was kind of his direct teacher, I believe, he's, trying to use this model but generalize it through this idea of the insistence of the signifying chain. And the reason that has always jumped out at me is that at least particularly the first time I had one of these episodes, the verbal hallucination thought echo component was by far the dominant kind of component. So I experienced it was as if it wasn't like I was hearing multiple voices per se. It was more that there was a single voice constantly in my head that was not was not mine, right? Like it wasn't necessarily assigned to another person, but it also wasn't mine in the sense of my ego. I wasn't voluntarily like producing it. And it seemed to follow a certain kind of intrinsic structure to me at the time. And I think part of the messianic element, at least the way I've tried to make sense of it since, is that I guess I do think of it in a kind of Buddhist, in a bit of a Buddhist sense, that there is a religious truth to this idea of the suspension of the ego, the centered ego, and the recognition of it as an illusion, fundamentally an illusion of a certain kind, right? And it might be this extremely deeply embedded illusion that we require in order to do many of the things that we do as human beings, right? It may be that a great deal of our capacities as human beings have been built upon this fiction, as it were. But I do think there is something to the argument that psychotics are in a perhaps overwhelming way in a way that's overpowering and overwhelming, whereas for perhaps a religious mystic, it's more tranquil and serene, breaking through the kind of fiction of the ego into a more direct encounter with this kind of unconscious signifying chain and its continual unfolding. And I think the messianic components of that really, it can feel this kind of Dionysian return to oneness kind of thing, right? Like you are no longer this individual consciousness, but you are kind of a fragment of the world that God's consciousness is currently reflecting upon, as it were. And there's some way in which, I think when I at one time found the kind of Buddhist idea of the eye of the Tathagata, or like the eye of the Buddha, kind of like looking down and upon the Buddha at a particular point, whoever's the Tathagata's eye focuses on is kind of like, I found that to be a kind of illustrative model, at least of what I was experiencing. And I think also maybe what Schreber's experiencing through these rays. It's almost like that idea of yourself as specifically chosen is perhaps this attempt to assign an individual, I see it as sort of a reflex. Like I'm used to thinking of myself as an individual. I'm used to thinking of myself as an ego. Now I've been like thrown out of the ego and onto this almost kind of collective unconscious, this multiplicity, this kind of feeling of unity with everything. But I still have this impulse that I need to like attach it to the individual subjectivity that I am. And I think that's when the kind of messianic feeling comes in, and perhaps the kind of mistaken reasoning and the kind of messianic complex comes in, and I think this gets at perhaps some of the more concerning parts of Schreber's delirium, like some of the things that Elias Canetti picks up on, for example, in Crowds and Power, as the kind of narcissistic parts of the paranoid mechanism that he sees as part of a fascist psychology. I mean, of course, you can see messianic elements, all kinds of messianic elements in fascism's attempt to, save spiritual civilization or what have you. But I think it is this process through which we are trying to figure out how we negotiate this moment in which we're thrown back on what's something that is like the truth of our unconscious, but one that is extremely difficult to bear because the way we're used to bearing it is through this fiction of the ego.
I'm curious, what is your relationship to philosophy amidst these experiences? I'll just say a little bit about myself, which is episodes that I've had in the past, kind of dissociative episodes where I was left feeling nebulous and uncertain. An encounter with philosophy amidst that had an extremely grounding effect for me. And so, like, when I see people online dismiss philosophy as an enterprise or diminish its importance somehow, I sometimes reflect on the fact that this was a kind of lifeline or a buoy that I grabbed onto in the midst of these events. It stabilized me and it grounded me. But where does philosophy stand in terms of the ecosystem that you are now forced to live within?
I think that I think that philosophy and madness in many ways are two sides of the same coin. One thing that, and when I get around to posting the parts of the Schreber piece that I've written, one theorist who I reference is Louis Sass in his book Madness and Modernism. And he makes a really interesting case against what you can think of as the kind of classic Freudian regression models of psychosis. And this classic model, and we can see the way in which Freud's reading of Schreber is precisely along this model. It's a regression to a kind of infantile autoeroticism prior to the heterosexual object choice, the choice of the other sex as a sexual object, in which, you know, we still have the self as the only sexual object, and the kind of latent homosexuality for Freud in the Schreber case is the fact that, you know, we model the desired other still on our own genitalia, right? And so we have this regression model of Schreber psychosis. Sass is interested in the ways in which schizophrenia particularly seems to evoke not regression at all, but a hyper intensification of thought to a point where the individual gets almost caught in these kind of philosophical paradoxes made real. You can even see, and with certain versions of this are particularly striking. So Capgras syndrome, for example, I believe is the one where you believe that your loved ones, friends, people around you see this in Schreber's delirium, this idea of the fleeting improvised men that he believes have been conjured up by God in the world around him, which he thinks has actually been destroyed. Well, philosophers very often, in fact, you can find thousands upon thousands of pages of philosophers arguing in precise technical ways about whether we can ever really demonstrate the existence of other minds, and whether I can ever actually prove that you were not an automaton, you were not, you know, an artificial intelligence, whatever, a homunculus inside a golem, whatever else. If we take Sass's intuition, the schizophrenic is somebody who has started to take those kinds of philosophical skeptical paradoxes with deadly seriousness, right? There's a kind of fundamental disruption of thought has occurred where this, you know, this almost like hypostasization of thought, where, you know, the inability to demonstrate existence is thus taken as evidence of non-existence. This is something that I think that R.D. Laing also talks about a lot in The Divided Self. We have an upset kitty here.
A couple of
when the kitty demands when the kitties demand attention, they trust me, I know they got to get their attention. But I think what I find powerful or evocative about this paradigm is that it shows us the ways in which it's not, again, not to try to glamorize madness and say that it's another version of of access to the truth in the same way as philosophy. It's that philosophy is one of these ways in which we try to work through, to take Wittgenstein's word, these deep, now I forget the exact word, deep disillusionment, now I'm going to forget the word he uses, but deep disquietudes about the human condition, right? And then we find these expressed in our language in the sense that our concepts, these concepts that we cannot fail to use as inhabitants of this, you know, language that is the house of being, that we find ourselves falling prey to these kinds of contradictions in thought that we can get fixated on. And this kind of hyper consciousness, hyper rationalization, I think is actually one of the key features in psychosis, not, or maybe kind of when paired with the kind of moment of regression. So like both sides of it, that I think makes these psychotic experiences very similar to philosophy. This is a similar point that Wouter Koesters makes in his book, A Philosophy of Madness, The Experience of Psychotic Thinking, the idea that these skeptical paradoxes for the philosopher are made real in the psychotic's experience. And the I think profound disquietude that you know introduces is the thought that, well, you know, if the skeptical philosopher is correct, then we are all standing on the ground we stand on as human beings in our language is a kind of madness, a kind of collective fiction, right? And the madman sees through this in some fashion and can't process it in a way that maybe that allows him or her to continue living in a way that's recognized as normal in his or her society. The philosopher, say, also sees through this, but in a more localized, contained way in the form of the academic discourse of some kind. But you could also argue that in seeing through this, and this is I think to tie this back to Schreber, you can see this kind of insight into the total falseness, this total deception of our kind of public discourse and our language as also the kind of precursor to the fascist paranoid form of thinking. If we think of psychosis as an encounter with skeptical paradoxes made real, we also need to think about the ways in which profound generalized skepticism is the centerpiece of far-right conspiracy theory thinking. and how much resemblance that does have to the kind of paranoid conspiracy we find in Schreber. The idea that the entire because the conspiracy theory is not premised upon a partial or local skepticism, right? All kinds of local skepticisms are helpful or indispensable for the progress of science, right? We doubt particular, we never feel particularly fully certain of any particular truth. We should subject it to doubt. The conspiracy theorist instead takes the step towards this radical generalized doubt. What if everything that we see, like all the evidence of the senses and all of the public discourse, evidence that's accepted in the public discourse, what if that all of that is a carefully crafted lie? And therefore, the only way in which we can possibly get at reality is by penetrating behind appearances in each case, disregarding the way the evidence appears to be in each particular case. And there is something very similar to a generalized skepticism about the existence of the external world in philosophers, and whether everything is, in fact, this carefully crafted simulation or whatever else. You know, Eric Santner's book, My Own Private Germany, in which he describes the sort of what he calls the kind of crisis of symbolic investiture in Schreber's time, the kind of moment of a collapsing political order that will, later be the collapse of the Weimar Republic, a kind of collapsing modern bourgeois political and social order in which kind of symbolic reference for legitimizing your activity has started to lose their legitimacy, lose their appeal. And, calling attention to the ways then in which Schreber, for example, feeling that he has failed to fulfill this symbolically important role of the presiding judge that he's been appointed to, feeling that he's not up to the task. Santner reads this as part of this broader social crisis of being able to libidinally invest, as it were, in certain forms of symbolic authority, right? And this fits naturally with the Lacanian perspective, where for Lacan, psychosis is this result of a kind of refusal to submit to symbolic authority. We refuse to admit a certain part of reality to symbolization. As a result of that, it doesn't form the kind of neurotic symptom. It instead returns in the real in the form of a hallucination. And this is sort of Lacan's key move in reading the Schreber case. But we can see, how in Santner's reading, we can see that how Schreber's, the crisis of symbolizing legitimate authority in general enters into this paranoid concern about a crisis in God's cosmic authority, right? A way in which God has contradicted his own authority, has contradicted the order of the world that he's supposed to uphold.
Maybe we should talk a little bit about what you see as the future of MAD studies and the ways in which understanding what we call mental illness, what we call madness, as integrating into political movements for liberation. What do you think the frontier of that looks like now, especially now that we face an intensely biopolitical obstacle in the form of the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think I don't want to speak for people. The reality is that I consider myself still a relative newcomer to the kind of neurodiversity movement and to the MAD studies movement. So I don't want to position myself as being able to speak for the people who are really on the front lines of these struggles. Whether I think it is the frontier. I think you can see the fact that we are problematizing this in this moment as, in some sense, expressing the frontier. I think seeing the ways in which, as you said, this intense biopolitical moment, whether it's the assigning a kind of who is considered disabled or abled in the case of the COVID pandemic, and the kind of biopolitical crises of maintaining public health and in the kind of lies that are cast aside throughout that, to the way in which we are now seeing, I think, what we will see as a mass construction of kind of madness or irrationality being used to medicalize and pathologize the trans community or the LGBTQ plus community in general. The ways in which, I think, calling attention to the ways in which madness has often been over-diagnosed in the Black population in the United States, for example, Black men being heavily over-diagnosed with schizophrenia, and to kind of cast them as being aggressive, having violent and aggressive tendencies. I think there's a way in which, like right now, what we see with the Trump administration is in rapid escalating attempt to broaden out the category of terrorism that we have inherited from the Bush administration and its massive expansion of the security state to apparently include any sort of opposition to the regime, right? And this is going to start, we see is starting with extremely vulnerable, and in some cases, not even people you would expect to be the most vulnerable. In some cases, established academics, for example, we're seeing being subjected to this terror security state. But I think that the reality is that we are inevitably going to see the way in which the biopolitical kind of dimensions of this will start to seize upon all of these populations and cast them as fundamentally, whether they're the parasite class, and as Elon Musk likes to describe it, or casting people in the LGBTQ movement as essentially disabled, as essentially mentally ill. I think we're going to increasingly see the powers that be fully embrace the kind of eugenic tendencies in those. Like those are already written into kind of the fabric of modern biopower in the modern state. But I think we're going to increasingly see those being drawn much more explicitly to justify more and more mass incarceration and fascist violence under this administration. So I think in some ways there's now is a critical moment to be thinking about these questions of madness and psychosis.
And it seems obvious to me that we are now at a political moment where there's a very stark overlap between the oppressions experienced by LGBTQ, the transgender community specifically, and of course, those who are struggling with social issues related to their neurodiversity, on the basis of the ways that Trump and Elon are trying to gut the economy. They're projecting this image of saving the government tons of money by gutting USAID, and the examples that they hold up often have to do with quote unquote wokeness and what have you. I think most recently, the University of Pennsylvania was denied $175 million worth of funding on the basis of the fact that they supported a transgender athlete. And these attacks also extend to academics as well. And this is a time for all of those communities to get together and get under the same banner, because they're putting us under that banner whether we like it or not.
Yeah, and I think the fact, in some sense, the fact that they are is, if we want to try to see the positive side of this, or the way it can be transformed into an opportunity, I think it's an opportunity to expose the workings of kind of modern biopolitical rationality at its most kind of cynical and naked, right? Where at a time where we might have previously had kind of a separate medicalized discourse for the mentally ill and the mad, versus a toxic patriarchal religious discourse that is designed to target the LGBTQ community. I think we've already seen there's in terms of the neurodiversity movement, neuroqueer scholars like Nick Walker, for example, have already highlighted all of the ways in which now constructions of madness and mental illness have been intimately bound up with the history of the LGBTQ community and the kind of labels that have been assigned to them. And I think building kind of solidarity between those movements as kind of ways in which we can, like, I think the underside of them, the kind of fascist powers essentially grouping all of these people together as targets, is the opportunity to recognize the ways in which we are all fundamentally exposed to the same machinations of a kind of modern power of normalization that is now becoming just utterly malignant death drive in the form of an administration that wants to sadistically inflict pain on anything that resembles difference or deviance from traditional identities. And I mean, I think it can be like corny, and it can sound like the kind of postmodernism of yesterday, but it's still these kinds of basic points about identity and difference remain in just an unavoidable paradigm for understanding the kind of psychological orientation that underpins the kind of escalating violence we're seeing.
Yes. Well, with that said, let's just talk a little bit more about this blog piece and your Substack, and where people can continue to read what will become a series then on Judge Schreber and the analyses that follow this case.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try to tidy up what I have and post the first segment of this later today after we wrap up recording. But I'm, in the midst of writing this kind of longish piece on Schreber. And yeah, my plan is to kind of go through and unpack both what we've already talked through in the episode today, largely with respect to Schreber's own experiences, what he's written in the memoirs, but also start to unpack Freud's reading, Freud's interpretation, Lacan's interpretation, the way Deleuze and Guattari then situate Schreber in their critique of Freud, and also to try to tie this together with some other early psychoanalytic literature on the mass psychology of fascism, and not just Wilhelm Reich, but there are other kind of lesser known figures kind of in Freud's early circle. Otto Fennekel is a good example of somebody who pioneers an important theory of fascist projection and what he calls idiosyncrasy or curiosity that becomes important to Adorno and Horkheimer's analysis, for example. I want to try to tie this kind of thread through Schreber's psychology together into something that is something like a statement of what we've been trying to do in the Schizoanalysis Project of like, what is it that is driving the mass psychology of fascism in our own era? How do we adapt this analysis and this understanding for the different technological, economic, historical conditions of our time? And what can this case really tell us about how to counter fascist paranoia today from a grassroots standpoint, not just a grassroots standpoint in the all the obvious political struggles that need to be fought, but the cultural struggle, the struggle in the public sphere, the struggle in terms of the production of subjectivity. I mean, what we see is not just a political takeover, but a mass production of fascist subjectivities and this kind of alt-right internet ecosystem among, people like Andrew Tate or any number of these figures. It is a mass production of fascist subjectivity. And I want to, and what I think we've been trying to work through with the Schizoanalysis Project, and hopefully what this piece will work through is trying to find our way to countering that production.
And this is probably a good time to let anyone who's listening for the first time to either one of us, there is a link to the Discord server that will be in the show notes to the Schizoanalysis Project. And we're not that far along in Anti-Oedipus. There is certainly time to catch up. And we have recorded multiple sessions for various page numbers within chapter 1 and now chapter 2. So you could join the Schizoanalysis Project and in the period of maybe 3 to 4 days, just kind of get caught up by reading along with our recordings and hopping on in, because there's other reading groups and other discussions happening there all the time. So with that said, Devin, I will say thanks again for joining me today on the show, and we will see you again sometime soon in the reading group.
Absolutely. Thank you again for having me. This was a really fun discussion. I appreciate it.